So Square Enix has announced a new mobile title called Dragon Quest Tact, and it looks really quite good as far as mobile free-to-play titles go. It'll have gacha mechanics in there, of course, and while I'm not the world's biggest fan of free-to-play games and gacha mechanics, this one does have my interest because I am a big fan of Dragon Quest. And it looks a little bit like Fire Emblem Heroes, which I did get hooked on for quite a while, really, because it's easy pick up and play tactics action. Dragon Quest Tact has 3D monsters and fights and stuff, so it's a little bit different from the Fire Emblem title in that regard, but it looks like it's a similar kind of experience, and as a Dragon Quest fan, I have my hopes that it will get localized so I can at least try it out. There hasn't been a localization announced for it just yet, but I would say there's better than even odds that it would happen. It sounds like a no-brainer, really, that Square Enix would want to localize that and tap into the small but quite rabid fan base for Dragon Quest outside of Japan. The footage that you're seeing in front of you is not from Dragon Quest Tact, though, so you're probably wondering why I've gone and done that and started talking about a game that is different to what I'm showing on the screen. But Dragon Quest Tact looks like a kind of board game experience, and when I was looking at it, I actually immediately kind of had another series of Square Enix's jump into my mind, one that really doesn't get localized as much as it deserves to, I feel, and is probably Square Enix's most underappreciated and unknown property, and that is Itadaki Street, which translates roughly to Fortune Street in the West. The reason it's known as Itadaki Street is principally because there's only been one game in the series that has ever been released outside of Japan, and that was on the Wii. It was called Fortune Street in the US and Boom Street in Europe and Australia, and it was a Wii title that Nintendo published. And the reason Nintendo took it on was because it was a collaboration with Nintendo, so it had Mario characters and stuff in it, which is unusual for the series. Usually the series has a combination of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest characters in there, but it is a long-running series, and it has always struck me as really odd that Square Enix has not actually localized it, because, yeah, it's really good. And I don't know how well Boom Street sold. I can't imagine it sold too well, because it is a very... It was the first release of the series outside of Japan in a very niche kind of genre. But it was one that I really wish that Square Enix had have persisted with. There was this one that you're seeing on the screen in front of you was released after the Wii one, and it was released a couple of years ago now, so the chances of it actually getting ported to the West are basically zero. It was a Vita and PlayStation 4 title. And having just recorded that section, I just realised there was one other Fortune Street game that was released in English, and that was on mobile devices, Fortune Street Smart. I don't know if that game is still available to buy and download, actually. As you would probably know, with iOS games they need to be updated to stay current with the operating systems and devices of the time, and if a developer decides not to update the game, then it gets pulled from stores and you can't download it any longer. I don't know if Fortune Street Smart is one of those as well, but I did spend a lot of time playing it because it was the only option for a Fortune Street fan, as I have become. So yes, that's an amendment to the previous statement that I made. So you probably haven't played Fortune Street unless you're one of the ones who picked up Fortune Street or Boom Street. So I'll give you a quick summary of how you play it. It's basically Monopoly, but good. Monopoly is not a great game, as pretty much anybody who plays board games knows. It's easy to pick up and play, but it doesn't have depth, and it is overly reliant on the dice rolls and luck and stuff. So it's not a game that has a great reputation amongst board game fans. Fortune Street has a couple of features that take it beyond Monopoly and actually help it to stand out, and I do know for a fact that there are people who absolutely hate Monopoly who love this game. Some of my friends are in that boat. They cannot stand Monopoly, but if you pull this out and you pull the Wii out, they jump all over it. One of the main features which separates this from Monopoly is the ability to buy stock. So the board is split up into a number of different regions or districts, and those districts might have 4 or 5 houses in them. You can buy stock in those districts, which actually boosts the house prices, And alternatively, if people invest in the houses, so they build, the equivalent of hotels and whatever on them to boost the rent if a person lands on those squares, it also lifts up the value of the stock. So you can actually make a lot of money in Fortune Street without actually buying property or relying on people landing on your property, because you can use the stock to boost. You can play the stock market where you buy shares in properties that other people are building up at the time. You sell shares to drop the value of properties, districts that other people are relying on, and you can kind of you can get into that kind of back end mechanics to kind of manipulate yourself through to a victory without necessarily needing to buy many properties. And I have actually played games of Fortune Street where I have had the least number of properties by a long way on the board, but because I have used that money to invest in Stockwell instead, I've actually managed to come out on top. So that's a really fun feature, and people really get into that. It takes a little while to understand the mechanics of how it works, but once you do understand it, it really adds that extra level of complexity and strategy to the Monopoly base experience, which is a really nice touch. Itadaki Street is still fairly reliant on dice rolls and things, because obviously you'll want to land on the right squares at the right time. But it's not just about properties. There are also a whole bunch of different chance squares and whatever, just like in Monopoly, but these ones tend to have a bigger impact. Here's an example here where you land on that, you get a card, and that card has a random effect. Those random effects can be pretty significant. They can range from everything from getting new properties to boosting the value of an entire district. There's one card, if you get really lucky, which gives you stock in every single district on the map, which is a big boost to your chances, especially if you get that early on and then have that huge extra resource of money to tap into by selling shares in the districts that you're not that interested in. There's also mini games. There's like this casino thing where you can wager money, and that casino changes greatly from one game to the next. This one has a whole bunch of Dragon Quest themed mini games. The Wii one had some really great ones, really good ones. There was slime racing where you could bet on which slime you thought was going to come through for the victory, and that was always so much fun. Whenever that happened in multiplayer, you'd have people really screaming out for their favourite coloured slime that they'd just bet some money on. So yeah, the mini games really help to liven the basic board game experience up. That's the thing, that's the benefit of playing digital board games. You're not constrained by the limitations of board and immobile plastic pieces. You can have animation and you can do all kinds of mini games and stuff, and Fortune Street's really taken advantage of that as well. So it feels like this really kind of comprehensive game. It's a simple board game in many ways, but it feels like it's not just a cheap port of an analog board game. It feels like something that's really been developed for video games. And then on top of all of that, you get the really nice license. There's the great Dragon Quest music that plays in the background. There's this really vibrant art style to every single one of the games in this series. And there's all the characters that you can play as. As you would have seen on the screen, I have been playing as Yuna, because this is a collaboration between Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And yeah, it's just a good opportunity to indulge a bit of fan service with your favourite characters. The thing I can never understand is why Square Enix does not release this outside of Japan. Square Enix is not a company that traditionally holds its cards too close to its chest and doesn't let its stuff leave its home country. There are some publishers in Japan that are really conservative about what they release outside of the country, but Square Enix is not one of those. There's been some, including Itadaki Street, but it's not a common practice for the company, let's put it that way. And a lot of games that are quite niche of interest outside of Japan still make their way if Square Enix is behind them. What confuses me is that board games are actually, if anything, more popular in the West than they are in Japan. Japan has a board game tradition, and it's from the early areas of shogi and Hanafuda through to more modern board games. You can go into toy shops and whatever, and you will find a healthy section dedicated to board games. But traditionally, Japan has not been the same kind of has not been as enthusiastic about board games as Western cultures. And this one being quite a traditional board game in a lot of ways, I would have always thought that it would have a resonance with the West, even if you're not necessarily a fan of Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy or any of the other licenses on display. The fact that it's that kind of familiar board game experience would have made it the kind of thing that you could pull out whenever there was a family party going on, and everybody could find a level that they could enjoy the game on. So it's always confused me that Square Enix has not seen any value of this series in the West. The one time that it did take a throw of the dice, proverbially speaking, it gave it to Nintendo to publish, and Square Enix has never really driven this series outside of Japan. So yeah, a little bit confusing. Would love to see it. I think it's a great quality series. I would love to see one come out on the Switch. I don't know any plans behind the series because obviously being a Japan-only series, it's hard to get information about what will happen for the series next, but it would be perfect on the Switch, and if it does, I'll certainly be importing it from Japan because I won't be able to get it from here in Australia. As a quick note at the end for localizers or for people who might be considering to pull it from the West, once you learn how the game plays, it's not very hard to get along with this series, even though it's all in Japanese. Because I'd played Boom Street, I was able to pick up this one and understand how to play very easily. So yeah, if you can grab the mobile version, perhaps do so and see if you can learn the basic rules, and then if you can, then give this a go afterwards. Thanks very much as always for watching. Please do like and subscribe and all of that, and please do back me on Patreon if you enjoy my videos. Otherwise, we'll see you at the next one.